There is a photograph, faded to the pale yellow of old newsprint, that hangs in the county extension office in a small building near the edge of a high plains town most people drive through without stopping. In it, a woman stands beside a water trough. The trough is full. Behind her, the pasture is green. Behind the pasture, the horizon is the color of ash, and everything between that horizon and the edge of her fence is brown as a fired brick. She is not smiling. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the trough. Somebody wrote on the back of the photograph in pencil, in letters so small you have to tilt the photograph toward the window light to read them. The water knows where it wants to go, and the only question is whether you will be ready when it arrives. That sentence is the whole story, but the story takes a long time to understand. Her name was Cecilia Marsh, and in the spring of the year before the long, dry summer that broke a third of the ranchers in that county, she bought 28 steers at the county auction for a price so low the auctioneer repeated the number twice as if he had misheard himself. She bought them because they were thin. She bought them because no one else wanted them. She bought them because in the ledger her grandmother had kept for 40 years on this same piece of ground, there was a number that told her she could feed them through what was coming, and she believed that number more than she believed the forecast, more than she believed the extension agent, more than she believed the men at the sale barn who shook their heads behind her back before she had even loaded the last steer into the trailer. The steers were poor. That is the plainest word for it. Their hip bones cast shadows. Their coats were rough as old rope, and their eyes had the flat, turned inward look of animals that have been somewhere too hot and not fed enough. A man named Gerald Purcell watched her run them off the trailer and into the small holding pen near the barn, and he stood at the fence with his elbows on the top rail and his good hat pushed back on his head. And he said, "Cecilia, I have to be honest with you. I have always been straight with you, and I am telling you as a neighbor and as someone who has been managing cattle in this county for 30 years that you have made a mistake." He said it kindly. That was the part that cost her something. He was not mean about it. He was gentle about it, the way you are gentle with someone who has just done something you cannot undo for them. He said he would take them back off her hands at cost if she wanted, that he knew a man in the next county who processed steers for the institutional market and would not look too hard at the condition, and that nobody would think less of her for correcting course now. She thanked him. She said she appreciated the offer. She said, "I think I will hold them." Then she went inside and did not come back out until he was gone. Her grandmother's name had been Ruth Ellery before she married, and Ruth Ellery had homesteaded this same ground in the first decade of the century before last. Not the romantic kind of homesteading that gets written up in county histories, the grinding kind, the kind where you wake up and the wind has taken the roof section off the equipment shed, and the well has dropped 2 feet overnight, and you do not have the money to hire anyone. So you fix it yourself and you go to bed, and you do not write a word in your journal about how you felt, only what you measured. Ruth Ellery had kept a journal for 41 years, volume after volume, and the journals were not sentimental. They were numbers, inches of rain by month, depths of the well by season, weights of cattle by year, yields of the small hay meadow, temperatures by decade. They were a record and a system, and they told you, if you read them carefully, that the high plains did not give its droughts in random order, but in a pattern you could feel coming if you had enough years to look back at. Ruth Ellery had written in the margin of the 4th volume, in her small, even hand. The water knows where it wants to go, and the only question is whether you will be ready when it arrives. Cecilia had read that sentence when she was 9 years old, and she had not understood it. She had read it again at 22 when her mother died and left her the land and the journals, and she had understood it a little more. She had read it again at 41, standing in the kitchen in the early dark of March, the journals spread across the table, the numbers laid out before her in columns, and she had understood it completely. The numbers told her this: in each of the 3 decades represented in the journals where the spring rains came heavy and warm, and everyone planted wide and bought cattle on optimism, the third summer had gone dry. Not merely dry, historically dry. The kind of dry where the creek beds opened up like old wounds, and the grass went from yellow to gray and then simply stopped. The kind where ranchers who had overstocked in the good years found themselves in August with more cattle than they could feed and water they could not find. She had cross-referenced Ruth Ellery's numbers against the county records she could get from the extension office, against the old newspaper clippings in the archive box in the back bedroom, against the soil service data she had requested by mail the previous autumn. The spring rains had been heavy. The pastures were lush. The sale barn was full of fat, hopeful cattle, selling at prices that made her neighbor Gerald Purcell expand his herd by 60 head in February alone. Everyone felt the good feeling that a wet spring gives you. She felt it too. But Ruth Ellery's numbers were in columns on the kitchen table, and the columns said what they said. So she had spent the winter not buying more cattle, but doing something else. Something that looked, to anyone who drove past on the county road and looked over the fence, like a tremendous amount of pointless digging. She had hired one man, a quiet person named Dillard Foss, who had worked for her mother for a season and who had a gift for reading ground the way some people read print, and together the two of them had spent 4 months moving earth. They were not digging wells exactly. They were doing something older than wells. Ruth Ellery's journals described the system in the 5th volume, attributed to a method she had learned from an old rancher named Cutter Bird, who had run cattle on this country before the fences went in, a man who had survived 3 hard droughts in his time, and who had told Ruth Ellery that water does not appear from nowhere and it does not disappear to nowhere. It goes where the ground tells it to go, and if you shape the ground correctly, you can tell the water where to stay. What they were building was a series of contoured earthworks, shallow and precise, that would slow the movement of water across the slope of the pasture, spread it wide instead of letting it run in channels to the creek, and press it down into the soil where it would sit in the subsoil all through a dry summer like a hidden lung, breathing moisture slowly upward into the root zone. The work was slow. The work was ugly. The finished earthworks looked like long, shallow scars across the pasture, and to the untrained eye, they looked like nothing more than the ruts of heavy equipment. Gerald Purcell stopped at the fence again in late February while they were still at it and asked what on earth she was doing to her pasture. She said, slowing the water down. He said, "You are going to damage your root structure." She said she did not think so. He said, "Cecilia, I am not trying to interfere. I want you to know I have the highest respect for you, but I have had a range consultant out here. I have had the NRCS man out here, and I can tell you that what you are spending on earthwork and those skinny sale barn cattle, you are going to be in a very difficult position this fall." She thanked him. She said she appreciated the concern. She went back to work. He drove away. Dillard Foss watched the truck go down the road and said nothing, which was the kind of thing Dillard Foss was good at. The smothering kindness was the hardest part. Her neighbor to the south, a woman named Pat Creed, who had been a friend of her mother's and who brought food to anyone in the county who was sick or grieving or, in her opinion, making poor decisions, arrived one Saturday morning in April with a casserole dish wrapped in foil and the careful expression of someone delivering a verdict dressed as a gift. Pat said she had heard about the cattle purchase, and she wanted Cecilia to know that grief does things to people, that losing her mother and then that bad year with the hay prices, that it was understandable that a person's judgment might not be at its most reliable, and that she had spoken to her own son, who was on the board of the local operating loan office, and he had said that if Cecilia wanted to talk to someone about restructuring her note before things got difficult, there was no shame in that. None at all. Cecilia thanked her. She said the casserole looked wonderful. She said, "I am not grieving, Pat. I am grazing." Pat went home unconvinced. The man from the bank came in May. His name was Horace Aldred, and he was not unkind either, which continued the pattern. He said the bank had been watching the county as a whole, and that there were some concerns, not specific to Cecilia, general concerns, about operators who were carrying thin inventory on damaged pasture, and he wanted to make sure she had a plan. She told him about the earthworks. He wrote something down. She told him about Ruth Ellery's journals and the drought pattern. He stopped writing and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been trained to be polite about things he does not understand. He said that was interesting. He said the thing about these cyclical theories was that they were retrospective, and the market was forward-looking, and he would feel more comfortable if she had a larger feed reserve contracted. She said she had a feed reserve. He said, "How large?" She told him. He wrote it down, and his expression changed slightly, the way expressions change when a number is larger than expected. He thanked her and left. She went back to the pasture. Dillard Foss was the one who said it plainly. He said it in June when they were moving the 28 steers to the north section, which by then had changed. The earthworks had done their work through the heavy April rains. The water had spread. The soil had taken it in. Where the other pastures in the county were already beginning to show the faint yellow at the tips of the grass that precedes the deep burn of a dry summer, her north section had a density of root and moisture in the subsoil that had not been there before. Dillard Foss walked through the grass to his knees and said, "This is different." She said, "Yes." He said, "The steers have put on weight." She said, "Yes." He said, "Ruth Ellery knew this country." She said, "She did." That was the whole conversation. They moved the cattle. July was the month the county understood what was happening to it. It came the way those things come, not all at once, but in a series of absences. The creek dropped below the low crossing on the 14th. The hayfields began to fail in the third week. The cattle on Gerald Purcell's place, all 90 of them, including the 60 head he had bought in February on the strength of the wet spring, began to lose condition faster than he could correct for, and by the last week of July, he was hauling water in a tank truck, and it was costing him more per day than he could calculate without feeling sick. He called his range consultant, who told him to sell a portion of the herd before prices fell further. He called the NRCS man, who told him to apply for an emergency conservation program that would not pay out until October. He called his banker, Horace Aldred, who told him the bank's position had not changed, but that the bank was sympathetic. Cecilia drove the county road in July and watched. She watched without satisfaction. That is the important thing to understand about what she felt. She did not feel vindicated in the way that is sweet. She felt the heaviness of having been right about something terrible. She had known what was coming, and she had prepared for it, and the preparation had cost her 4 months of hard physical labor and every favor she was owed in 3 counties, and every number in Ruth Ellery's journals. And none of that made the drought less real or the suffering of the cattle along that road less visible. She drove home. She checked the soil moisture in the north pasture. She checked the subsoil levels at the monitoring points she and Dillard Foss had driven in February. The numbers were what the numbers were, and the numbers were good. The water knows where it wants to go, and the only question is whether you will be ready when it arrives. She fed her steers. The steers were no longer the hollow-sided animals she had loaded at the sale barn in March. They were not fat, not yet, but they were solid, and their eyes had changed, had gotten that quality of attention and presence back that animals have when they are not spending all their energy on the arithmetic of survival. Dillard Foss said on a Tuesday morning in late July, standing by the water trough in the north section with his hat in his hand, and the dry plains spread out brown and quiet on every side of the fence. "These are good cattle now," she said. "They always were." He put his hat back on. She threw a flake of hay over the fence. August was the month the sky came down. Not rain, the opposite of rain. A heat that arrived in the second week and did not leave. A heat that had weight and texture, that lay on the land like something physical. And under it, the pastures that had already been brown went gray, and then went the color of old concrete, and the water in the stock tanks in the county dropped by inches per day. And the cattle in the county that had not been sold in July because the ranchers had hoped for a turn began to show the signs of genuine distress. Gerald Purcell's place was quiet in a way that pastures should not be quiet. The cattle stood in the shade of the one tree line on the north end of his property and did not move much. He had sold 30 head in the last week of July at a loss that he had not let himself add up yet. He still had 60. He had water for perhaps another 10 days at the rate they were going through it. And the forecast said no rain for 3 weeks. He drove to Cecilia Marsh's gate on the morning of August 14th. He sat in the truck for a time before he got out. She watched him from the kitchen window. She went outside and met him at the gate. He did not have the good hat on. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, which he had not, and he looked like a man who had something to say and could not find the first word of it. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said nothing. He said, "I was wrong, and I knew more than I let myself know, and I am sorry for the things I said in February." His voice had the particular quality of a voice that has been used to certainty for a long time, and is now carrying something it was not built for. She said, "I know it." He said, "I have 60 head, and I have 10 days of water." He did not ask. He was not able to ask yet. She said, "I have a stock pond in the south section that has 3 feet of water in it, and I am using the north trough for my herd." She said, "You can pull your 60 head across onto my south pasture and use the pond." He looked at the ground. He said, "What do you want for it?" She said, "A handshake." He said, "Cecilia, I cannot let you do that." She said, "It is already done, Gerald. Go get your cattle." He turned back twice, walking to his truck. Both times he turned back, he did not say anything. She understood that. Some things are too large for words, and the attempt only diminishes them. He drove out and came back in 2 hours with 60 cattle moving along the road, and Dillard Foss met him at the south gate and helped him get them through without making a production of it. And the cattle smelled the water in the pond from 200 yards out and moved toward it in that particular, urgent way that thirsty animals move. Not running, but purposeful. And Gerald Purcell stood at the gate and watched them drink, and he pressed his mouth into a flat line and looked at a point in the middle distance. Pat Creed lost her small hay operation in August. The Aldred Bank called 3 notes in the third week of the month. Two families who had been on their ground for 2 generations made decisions in August that September would make permanent. Cecilia knew about all of it. The county is small, and the news moves through it the way the dry wind moves, low and pervasive and without mercy. She went to the extension office and she brought Ruth Ellery's journals, all 22 volumes of them, and she sat with the extension agent, a young man named Torres who was new enough to the county to still be genuinely curious about things, and she walked him through the numbers. She walked him through the earthwork system. She showed him the before and the after in her pasture. She walked him through the drought pattern and the forecasting logic as it appeared in the margins of the journals in Ruth Ellery's small, even hand. Torres took notes. He asked questions. He was the first official person who had asked her questions that were not actually statements wearing question mark clothing, and she answered every one of them. She filed the journals with the extension office under a deed of permanent access. Any rancher in the county could come and read them. Any rancher could call Torres and ask about the earthwork method. She had Dillard Foss write out the specifications for the contoured system, the depths and slopes and spacings, in terms plain enough that a person with a tractor and a willingness to spend a winter on it could do the work themselves. She asked for nothing in return. Torres asked her why she was sharing it. She said, Ruth Ellery did not invent this. She learned it from a man who learned it from the country itself. I am only keeping it in circulation. The autumn came in September, and the rains came with it. Too late for the worst of what the county had suffered, but real enough to remind people what grass smelled like when it was wet. Gerald Purcell moved his 60 cattle back to his own pasture on the 3rd of September, and he came to the gate himself. And he did not try to make words of it. He just stood there and shook her hand for a long time. His 60 head had come through in reasonable condition, and the loss he had taken would not ruin him, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, a great deal more than most of his neighbors could say. He spent that winter on his own earthworks. Dillard Foss helped him on Saturdays. The photograph was taken by Torres in the first week of October, before the green faded, while the contrast between her pasture and the land outside her fence was still visible enough to be instructive. He hung it in the extension office as a teaching document. Ranchers who came in through that autumn and winter to read Ruth Ellery's journals often stopped in front of it. Most of them did not say anything for a moment. Then most of them asked Torres the same question, not about the earthworks and not about the drought pattern, but about her face, about the particular quality of her expression, about the fact that she was looking at the water in the trough rather than at the camera. Torres told them what Cecilia had told him. She said, the hard part was not the drought. The drought was just weather. The hard part was knowing it was coming and doing the work anyway, while people you respected told you kindly that you were wrong. Cecilia Marsh ran that place for another 19 years after the long, dry summer. The earthwork system she and Dillard Foss built in the winter before is still there. You can see it from the road if you know what to look at. The long, slow contours of the land, shaped just slightly against its natural inclination, holding water where water would otherwise leave. The steers she bought off the slaughter truck that March cleared a profit in October that paid for the earthwork twice over, though she did not mention that number to anyone until years later. She taught the system to 11 other ranchers in those 19 years, going out in winter and walking their land with them, and reading the slope of it the way Ruth Ellery had taught her to read, looking for the places where the water wanted to stop if only the ground would let it. She kept the journals in the extension office where she had put them, accessible to anyone, which over time meant they were read by students and researchers and, one academic who wrote a paper about historical adaptive management on the High Plains, and whose paper credited Ruth Ellery's system in its bibliography, which Cecilia read once, and did not comment on except to say that Ruth Ellery would have found the language of the abstract amusing. Dillard Foss worked her place until he was 68. He taught her daughter the same things he had taught Cecilia, the reading of ground and the reading of sky, and the quality of attention required to know the difference between weather and pattern. Her daughter runs the place now. The journals are still in the extension office, still accessible, still checked out several times a year by people who are learning to read the country the way the country wants to be read. On the day Cecilia Marsh died, Torres, who had by then been the extension agent for 21 years and had long since stopped being new enough to be surprised by anything, walked to the photograph on the wall and looked at it for a moment, and then turned it over and read the pencil sentence on the back. He had read it dozens of times. It still did the thing it did, which was to make the room feel very quiet and very old, as if the ground under the building were listening. The water knows where it wants to go, and the only question is whether you will be ready when it arrives. She was ready. She had done the work. She had read the numbers and believed them when believing them was not comfortable or convenient or socially easy. She had prepared for a disaster that had not yet arrived and had been patient through the long, ordinary months when preparation and foolishness look exactly alike from the outside. She had held 28 thin steers and a winter's worth of dug earth against the absolute certainty of her neighbor and her banker and her community's kindly pity. And she had been right, and being right had felt like weariness rather than triumph. And out of that weariness she had made a gift rather than a profit, and the gift had lasted longer than the drought and longer than the certainty and longer than the smothering kindness. And it is out there still, in the shape of the ground and in the numbers, in the journals, and in the green of the pasture that you can see from the road in the dry years, unmistakable. The way a thing is unmistakable when it was built to last.